How long would you last if you were the last person on the planet? And I don't mean how long you would survive, I mean how long would it take for absolute loneliness and boredom to break you? I've fantasized about this scenario many times in my life. The idea that all of the chaos and noise of 8 billion human beings could just vanish overnight and leave me with the complete freedom to do what I want and go where I want has always been thrilling for me. The extroverts and people persons among you might immediately be horrified by the concept. For many, the idea of being totally alone might seem like a nightmare. But honestly, I find it quite peaceful, especially in the increasingly insane times we're living through, which make you want to shut your eyes and ears and completely check out to protect your own sanity. I've always thought that in this scenario, I'd just spend my remaining days traveling to random places and reading all the books I can before kicking the bucket. No more violence around, no suffering, no need to listen to people complain, no need to debate anyone on any topic. Sounds like heaven. But that's not very realistic, is it? I give myself more or less a year before I start going absolutely bonkers and revert to a caveman. The concept of being the last person on the planet has been explored a bunch of times in media throughout the years. The first thing that usually comes to mind is some sort of post-apocalyptic scenario. Maybe there's been a terrible virus that wiped out the world's population, maybe some kind of a nuclear war or a zombie outbreak, or even some mysterious biblical-style rapture. The last man trope has existed at least since the 1800s, with poems and stories by people like Lord Byron, Mary Shelley, Edgar Allan Poe, and many others, culminating in the works of H.G. Wells at the end of the century and then really booming in the 1900s, especially after the Second World War, which showed a never-witnessed-before potential for destruction. Films and TV shows soon ran with the theme and codified this trope even more. These show us, in theory, how a person left to their devices in such a context might act, what their immediate concerns would be, how loneliness might weigh on their psyche and stuff like that. What we very often see represented is, first of all, the person slowly realizing that they're all alone. They're usually stumbling around an empty town, calling out to anybody who could hear them while everything's unnaturally quiet. Then they usually start accepting the situation and realize that they can do whatever they want. So they start satisfying all of their materialistic desires. They might go and steal everything they want from stores, start driving a fancy car, move into a big mansion, steal works of art, and eat and drink whatever expensive thing they want. It's almost heavenly. They can go around breaking stuff, do things they could never have done due to the law and to other people being around, finding a new kind of complete freedom, where the world is truly their oyster. But after a while of this freedom, they usually run out of steam and things become increasingly depressing. The lack of anybody else to have a conversation with, to form some kind of bond, or a society in which they could feel some kind of purpose that reflects on other people around them, becomes too much, and our protagonist starts spiraling. Maybe they start talking to inanimate objects or to themselves, they drown their sorrows with alcohol, or they might even give up and try to off themselves. Their lowest point is often the one where something major needs to shift, and this is usually the moment where they find out they're not actually alone. So let's get into some of the biggest examples, see what they do right and where they stumble, and then try to understand why this last man trope has been codified in some specific weird ways. The Last Man on Earth is one of the most obvious examples of this trope in recent memory, and boy do I have some things to say about it. The show follows the story of Phil Miller, just a normal dude, as he deals with, seemingly, being the last guy left in the United States after a deadly virus has wiped out the population. At first, he travels around the country, checking out every state to try and find survivors, but having no luck, he decides to drive back home to Tucson. Here he says to hell with it and starts living large. He moves into a big mansion, starts bringing in famous paintings, artifacts and props, starts using the town as his playground, destroying things and not even bothering to put on some clothes or open doors as he can just... He basically tries to do whatever he can to stave off boredom. Having no one to talk to, he tries to talk with God, saying that the thing he'd want most at this point is a woman. We'll get back to that, don't worry. After 5 months of this, he is obviously in a destructive spiral. The mansion is a disgusting mess and he's basically become an alcoholic, even filling up an entire kiddie pool with alcohol and laying in it while he drinks. And all of this is generally quite harrowing if you're not distracted by all the jokes, which, to be fair, it is a comedy series after all. At this point, he's talking to balls on which he drew faces, castaway style, and even tries to hit on a mannequin. I'll be keeping a tally on some things throughout the video, and I'm adding a +1 on the interacting with mannequins section. It'll make more sense later. At the lowest point of his spiral, Phil decides that he's done. He can't go on living in such loneliness, so he paints a giant target on a boulder, and as he's about to ram into it with his truck, he sees smoke in the distance. And here the real problems start. So, for a show called The Last Man on Earth, that's a pretty long list of actors, isn't it? It should have been called The Last Man on Earth for 17 minutes of runtime, then the other people start showing up. Because this is where we get introduced to Carol, the last woman on Earth, for like 2 episodes. In fact, here is how it goes. Phil finds her clothes drying on a wire and starts sniffing her bra. When she calls out to him, he faints. Waking up, he sees Alexandra Daddario cradling him in her lap and saying how happy she is to have found him, and the two kiss. Only it was not real, and when he actually wakes up, oh my god, it wasn't beautiful hot big booba actress Alexandra Daddario, it was ugly actress Kristen Schaal. Ew! You might think I'm exaggerating, but her not being hot is genuinely part of the plot. But obviously her looks being the problem would have been way too mean, so they also wrote her to be incredibly annoying. They literally speedrun Carol being annoying any percent. In this very first scene of their meeting, she pulls a gun on Phil, and while he tries to get her to put it down, she starts correcting him on his grammar. Yeah. In the very next scene, we realize that she doesn't get simple jokes, she corrects his grammar again, doesn't want to ruin her mugs by clinking them together while cheering, and also points out that you need to look a person in the eye while cheering. In the very next scene, she starts being pedantic about traffic laws and makes Phil stop at a stop sign, even though, as he points out, traffic doesn't exist anymore. I could go on, but I'm sure that you get the picture at this point. And Phil, well, he just plays along because he absolutely needs to smash. So the first 2 episodes are about them building a pretty unstable relationship, arguing, being annoying, etc. She says that if they're gonna smash, they absolutely need to get married first, so they do. Then I think they finally smash, but she's very weird in the bedroom talk side of things, and Phil ends up being kinda shocked by the experience. But fret not. The one time he doesn't stop at a stop sign, they T-bone a limousine, driven by the third character, Melissa, and oh my god, she's like super hot. Uh-oh, that's a big problem. Phil being Phil, he wants to smash her more than his now wife, because she's not as hot and also she's like super annoying, and so starts his quest to try and convince both of them that this is absolutely paramount to repopulate the earth and yada yada yada. As he's about to succeed, another character shows up. Do you see a pattern here? This time it's a man. Oh my god. Fret not, he's fat and bald and has a creepy mustache. He's no match for our average looking Phil. The problem is that he's the nicest dude ever and actually respects other people as opposed to our protagonist, so the hot Melissa decides that she'll actually go with him. And also genetic variety, you know, that's kind of important. Then 2 new female characters are introduced, and oh my god, can you stop introducing characters in a show called The Last Fucking Man on Earth? I genuinely felt scammed while watching it in 2015 as it was airing. Of course, once again, Phil hopes to smash them too. So I'll stop here with the recap. The show's got 4 seasons and has been cancelled, and back in the day I think I made it halfway through season 2 and then dropped it. It's not good. Don't worry, I'll get back to the main theme of this video soon, but I just want to comment a bit on a few things here. The biggest problem with this show is that the humor is painfully 2015. In the first 10 minutes of the show there's a joke about dudes with skinny jeans. That's how 2015 it is. The jokes themselves are not great, but the general writing and the pacing of the jokes is somehow even worse. I think that if this show wasn't a comedy or went lighter on the comedic elements, it would have been much better, because when it gets more dramatic it can actually be decent. Though Will Forte basically plays Phil as a cartoon character after like 2 episodes, while everybody else is actually trying to be a real person, no matter how strange they might be. So he kinda ruins any serious moments. Of course, the point is kind of the fact that Phil is actually the most annoying character for everyone else, in no small part because of how much of a selfish creep he is. I've seen people use the excuse that he's been alone for like 2.5 years at this point. The guy is just not alright in the head, that's why he acts like that. My dude, all of them have been alone for that long. Why is nobody else a disgusting creep? Anyway, just the pacing of the writing itself makes it impossible to take the show seriously even as a comedy. Nothing is really given the time to develop naturally, they just often cram everything they can into each dialogue line, just lame joke after lame joke, like I pointed out with the Carol being annoying speedrun. Maybe the jokes wouldn't feel so lame if they had any space to breathe, but I get that it's mostly a personal complaint. Some of you might actually like the show and its humor, and that's fine. But the one thing that does irk me is the underlying, what would you call it, lookism, beautism in it? And I don't want to seem like I'm just making up something to complain about, this is generally an element of the plot, at least in the first few episodes. From what I remember, I'm not gonna rewatch the whole thing. The thing is that in a well-written show, the problem of physical attraction being important between the last people on Earth could actually be a very interesting theme. But here it's mostly used for bad comedy's sake. And humor predicated on people's looks feels extremely outdated to me. I know 2015 was a different time, but come on. And this could be said about most things in the show, really. I wanted to start off with The Last Man on Earth because those first 17 minutes of him actually being alone are some of the best I've seen when it comes to the everyone's gone trope. His whole arc of still trying to find people, to settling down but still having some fun, to becoming completely depressed is the most straightforward representation of that situation. It is miserable and miserably funny at the same time. The hopefulness being completely squashed by resignation is how I see most of us faring in his shoes. Too bad the rest of the show is basically a bad sitcom which becomes messy in the whole morality department. You could say again that the point of the show is exactly the fact that Phil is a creep who needs to change and learn how to treat people better. But the way it was handled is sometimes just, I don't know. I find some of his behavior in some of these situations too creepy to be handled in a comedic way, especially when the humor itself is cringe and outright annoying. So watch those first 17 minutes for a good handling of the last man trope, but keep watching further only at your own risk, because the show basically does almost nothing with the concept and devolves into a run-of-the-mill sitcom. So at this point you might be thinking, why am I bothered by this stuff? Well, because while watching and rewatching stuff to write this video, I started to see a trend that I really hadn't noticed before. Namely, most of the stories I found that fit into this last man category end up treating the female characters just as an object of desire for the man, because the protagonist is always a dude, and she's the thing he wants to conquer, pretty much. And honestly, this one is not even the worst example, because in virtue of it being a TV show, the characters have much more time to develop, and the women don't really feel like powerless pawns, but the protagonist's own outlook on them can make it all feel very uncomfortable. And you might say, hey, isn't there a film called The Last Woman on Earth? Yeah, and what do you think this one is about? It's about a love triangle where the two guys both want the girl. How surprising. If you don't believe me, just keep this point in mind while I go over the other films. For now, I'll add a +1 into the women as pawns of man's desire category. Another more or less known example of the last man trope in film is The Quiet Earth from 1985. It tells the story of Zach, an Australian engineer who wakes up one day to find that, surprise surprise, everyone has suddenly disappeared. Once again, we have a long sequence of him just going around trying to find other people, slowly losing hope. In this one, he reaches the laboratory in which he used to work and tries to contact other laboratories around the world to no avail. He also finds the body of a co-worker of his. Here we learn that something called Operation Flashlight has been completed in the lab, a project of which Zack himself was a part, and which had a catastrophic effect on the human population. After this, he tries once again to find other people, but having no success, he decides to move into a huge mansion, starts wearing fancy pajamas, drinks champagne for breakfast, and lives large among expensive paintings. Unfortunately, his mental state quickly deteriorates and he starts going a bit mad. He speaks to himself pretending to be two people, which is something that briefly happened in The Last Man on Earth too. Then he even starts donning a women's nightgown, probably because he also really wants to smash. He starts talking to cardboard cutouts of historical figures and even holds a speech in front of them, looking like a Roman emperor. He spirals even more to the point that he puts a gun in his mouth and almost pulls the trigger, finally deciding against it. Here, surprisingly enough, he has a sort of rebirth arc, even symbolized by him bathing in the ocean. There's a lot of scenes in which he's naked, which I can't obviously show, this being one of them. He starts taking care of himself once more, moves into a smaller home, still fancy as hell though, and seems to just go about his business with an air of acceptance. But here, a beautiful woman named Joanne shows up. Of course, imagine my shock. Now, out of all the stuff I'll talk about here, the relationship between these two, at least during the middle arc of this film, is probably my favorite. While Zack obviously wants to smash, their attraction to each other doesn't seem as forced as in other cases, and he even seems quite tranquil about it all. Namely, this is not a situation in which they'll need to repopulate or anything. These two are just lonely and seem to be the only ones left, so after a while of hanging out together, their need for more intimate companionship kicks in. And yeah, they do smash. Things get thrown a bit out of whack though when a third character is introduced. A man named Appy. He seems like a pretty cool guy, and the scene in which the three of them hug is very sweet. But as you can imagine, all of this also devolves into a trite love triangle. And the way this is handled is very weird. At one point the characters seem to be just chilling, but very fast they start getting aggressive with each other, especially our two alpha dogs, with a pissing context devolving into a silly I'm in charge, no I'm in charge kind of deal, to the point where they start a damn car chase and nearly kill each other. But in the next moment they're all together again and things seem more or less alright. They want to go back to the lab because Zack realizes that the sun is about to explode or something, and that this Project Flashlight had some sort of dimensional shift effect. I'm not really sure, I kinda stopped listening at this point. So the idea here is to get a giant load of explosives and try to blow up the lab. One thing leads to another and Zack realizes that Joanne is more attracted to Appy than to him. And he kind of just accepts it, leaving them alone on purpose. Time which they quickly use to smash, of course, while Zack drives back in with the explosives and sacrifices himself to destroy the lab. Cockanger is scary, man. At the end, he wakes up on the beach with strange clouds and Saturn coming up on the horizon. Yeah, I don't know. It's also funny how they use the ending scene, which has the most interesting visuals on the film's poster. So, I had kind of high hopes for this film, and I do think that it isn't bad. The locations shown and a lot of the cinematography were absolutely beautiful. The whole being the last person on Earth section was also handled superbly, in my opinion, and also quite creatively. I love the section in which he's trying to call out to people in the middle of an empty city by playing a saxophone while it's raining. It's such a memorable moment. But the problem with it is the writing of the characters. They seem to randomly go from being kind of nice to apathetic to very angry indeed, without there really being any satisfying character building moments that warrant those switches. It generally feels like 30 minutes of dialogues were cut out from the film or something. The actors are also quite good, but sometimes it does seem like they themselves don't really get what the writers were going for, which makes for some strange reactions and deliveries, like they're not really able to portray the emotions the writers were going for.
Look, it's complicated enough for people like me without trying to explain to people like you. People like what? Will you listen to that?
Like, what? There's also obviously a little racially charged comment here which feels weirdly out of place, but it's probably because the film itself is inspired by another film we'll discuss in a moment that has racial tension as one of its main themes. In this scene it's probably just supposed to be a misunderstanding. When Zack says people like me, he's probably referring to the fact that he's a scientist and the other two aren't. And then there's the problem of Joanne. Her character is handled just as weirdly as the others. She seems like a pretty smart woman and is always shown to be a bit cheeky. Even in more than one way. But by the end, when they realize that they're attracted to each other, Appy and her both seem way too childish and cruel towards Zack for no real reason. I mean, the guy has basically accepted it, but they still find the time to mess with him by almost running him off the road with the truck, and then they just laugh about it. Psychos. There's also the whole thing of them, you know, smashing while he's gone, which is not nice. And just like with The Last Man on Earth, I get more or less what they're going for. Again, the problem of being so few and having sexual tensions and attractions rise is probably a realistic one, but it's never handled in a way that feels satisfying. The characters' emotional needs in this sense feel always way too simplistic, while I find that they would deserve an actual character study type of approach. In The Quiet Earth, everything after the introduction of Joanne feels rushed and underdeveloped, leaving you with a pretty bitter aftertaste. But once again, I want to stress that the first part, the one in which Zack is by himself and left to his devices, is absolutely well handled and interesting and makes the film worth watching. We are starting to see another trend here, aren't we? Anyway, this one also gets a +1 for women being mainly an object of desire for men. Also, I haven't mentioned it, but this one also gets a +1 for interacting with mannequins. So, as I said, there's also a direct line of inspiration here. We could say, with not much doubt, that The Quiet Earth probably inspired The Last Man on Earth. But both were probably also inspired by The World, The Flesh and the Devil from 1959. This time we follow, let me check Wikipedia, Black Mine Inspector Ralph Burton. Yes, the race angle will be relevant, I just find it funny that this is how the plot summary starts. Is he a normal mine inspector, Miss Bryan? No, he's black. So Ralph is working in a mine when suddenly there's a collapse and he remains trapped. He hears people coming to get him out of there and decides to wait. After 5 days, he realizes that nobody's actually coming, so he starts digging his way out of there. Having finally gotten out, he finds newspapers that in giant lettering reveal that the world is ending, which is a pretty funny way to show that. So from here, as you might expect, we have our usual sequence of the character going around and exploring the empty world. He finds a fancy car at a dealership and takes it, deciding to reach New York City. And when he reaches it, we get, in my opinion, the best Last Man in the World scenes so far. Him going around an empty New York, calling out and getting only his own voice's echo as an answer feels incredibly lonely. Especially thanks to the cinematography highlighting the huge empty buildings all around him and filming him from far above, making him seem so small and insignificant. Really compelling stuff. Ralph reaches a radio station where, playing a tape, he realizes that there's been a release of radioactive sodium isotopes in the atmosphere, which killed everyone in the 5 days he was underground and then dissipated just in time for him to not be affected. After this, we have our usual shtick. Ralph moves into a fancy apartment building and starts living large. In this case, we actually have a handy protagonist who even manages to restore power to his block, which was pretty cool for a change. He also finds a couple of mannequins and takes them with him for company, so there we go with another +1 on the mannequin thing. During all of this, we can at times see a mysterious woman, who we later learn is named Sarah, observing his daily activities. She finally reveals herself after Ralph throws one of the mannequins off his balcony, and she screams, thinking that it's Ralph himself falling to his death. After a bit of initial fear, the two actually start getting along and hanging out. He connects her building to the power supply and they have fancy breakfasts together and stuff like that. And this is where things get a bit complicated. While I was watching, I was thinking, damn, for being the oldest film on this list, this seems to have the best protagonist when it comes to how they handle themselves around women. He's a bit of a gentleman. He's always very respectful, doesn't seem like he wants to smash, even tells her that they shouldn't live in the same building and that she should stay at hers even if it's more inconvenient, even though she tries to push for it and seems somewhat interested in Ralph beyond their current friendship. And then it becomes clear, the problem here is actually race. Seeing as Ralph is black and Sarah is...
I'm free, white, and 21, and I'm going to do what I please.
He doesn't feel comfortable in getting too close to her, which I guess we could call an example of internalized racism on the part of the protagonist himself, a dynamic which I can't really comment on because I can't tell if it's supposed to be part of the critique here or if it's just a case of a white director writing a black character and projecting something. I prefer to think that it's the first case, but I think the film never makes it clear enough even by the end. And a big problem for me in trying to judge this is the film's historical context, seeing as it's from 1959. While watching it, I got curious, and for the first time learned that interracial marriage became legal in the whole United States only since 1967, which, damn dude, I knew it had to be late, but I didn't realize it was that late. And also general racial segregation, at least mandated by law, only started to get abolished since 1964. And look, this is an interesting kind of worms on its own. Before the civil rights movement started to push back on much of the shit that was considered acceptable, there were even rules that film studios had to follow, such as the infamous Hays Code, which were basically guidelines on what to not show in a film to make it morally alright. Among other very prudish for our modern sensibilities points, one of the things that couldn't be shown was miscegenation, basically mixed-race relationships. This, combined with the fact that the main actor Harry Belafonte was a social rights activist too, should make the intentions of the film pretty clear. Unfortunately, the racial issues, while being explicitly mentioned, seem mostly sidestepped by the end of it. You see, what happens is that Sarah laments that there's nobody left to marry for her, and Ralph says that he'll find someone. Suddenly, a third person arrives in New York. It's Benson Thacker, a white dude. And so Ralph decides that he'll try to leave them alone together as much as possible so they can basically get together and get married without his intromission. The problem is that Sarah is obviously in love with Ralph, and while she tries to get close to Benson because that would be the societally acceptable thing, it's obvious that her emotions are pulling her back. At the same time, it's clear that Ralph also feels something for her, but never wants to admit it, still seemingly fearing the rules of the old world because...
People might talk.
This makes Benson oh so mad, to the point he ends up confronting Ralph about it. Now, our guy kinda stands his ground, pointing out that they're not in the old times anymore. Basically, he doesn't want to stand in Benson's way, but he also won't be pushed around. This culminates in Benson grabbing a gun and basically forcing Ralph in a city-spanning duel. At the end, Ralph realizes how absurd the situation is and drops his gun, walking towards Benson, who can't bring himself to shoot his rival. Sarah shows up and grabs both dudes by the hands, and the three of them walk away towards the sunset and everything is perfect. Yeah, there are some issues here. First of all, Sarah is basically portrayed as a petulant child who gets random mood swings and can't make a choice for the life of her. I get that she's 21, but she comes off as the most cliché romantic female character in a soap opera. Her whole thing is basically crying about the fact that she won't be able to get married because the only man around who she actually likes is black, then getting mad at Ralph without giving much explanation. And Benson is very strange. It's never really clear what his problem is, but he's incredibly creepy towards Sarah.
Well, what about you, Sarah Crandall? Were you married or anything?
No, not married or anything.
Sooner or later, we'll have to discuss that, you and I.
Bro, what? This guy says that he has basically just lost his wife and daughter, but is now so over it that he implies Sarah should marry him.
I could force you. Could be easy. No one around to care if you scream. All the Boy Scouts out of town. Shall I force you?
What a psychopath. Also, he says he's no racist, but he says it like this.
I have nothing against Negroes, Ralph.
That's white of you.
So, you know, maybe for 59 that was a genuine way to say he's not a racist. I'm not really sure, but it obviously wouldn't fly today. It's obvious that there is still some superiority complex, at least to a modern viewer, while I'm not sure if it was meant to be that way 70 years ago, because that ending makes it seem like it's all right. So the mix of these two is just painful, but then you throw in Ralph being so flip-floppity about deciding between actually being stepped on and pushing back, and it just becomes a weird time. Nowadays, if contemporary viewers saw something like this, they would probably assume that this is partly a commentary on the internalized racism against their own race that somebody could harbor without even knowing it. They'd assume that it's showing Ralph in an internal fight against the ideas that this culture put in his head, to the point he still respects them even after the end of the world, which could be a pretty powerful theme actually. I'm just not sure that that's what they were thinking here. I want to believe that it was, seeing as Belafonte was involved in this, and the civil rights movement was already happening, but I don't know. It ends up being a strange little time capsule that proposes a beautiful representation of a person suddenly finding themselves completely alone in the world, but quickly degrades into a weird love triangle, where important racial issues are brought up at the cost of some distractingly sexist handling of the only female character, who's mostly infantilized. So there we go with another +1 on the women being mainly an object of desire for men. Yo, we're 3 for 3 on both so far. That's crazy. Now, seeing as we're in 59, let's stick to the period, because in the same year, the Twilight Zone made its debut. And you know what the very first episode of this famous show is about? A man finding himself as the apparently last person on Earth. It's not a lot, but it's interesting that it happened twice in 1 year, kinda beat. In Where Is Everybody, we see a man who doesn't remember who he is or where he is, coming across a diner. Here he tries to order some breakfast, but nobody is present. Well, that's pretty weird, but maybe they had to run out and do something important, right? When he then comes across a town, he starts to understand that the whole place is empty, soon coming to believe that he's the only one left. At his lowest moment of desperation, we finally find out what's happening. This was simply an experiment in preparation for the moon landing missions, to test the resistance of the pilot's psyche in isolation. Pretty straightforward, right? There's not really much to say about it. Honestly, in just 20 minutes, it can't really do too much, right? The whole thing is mostly a little horror piece on isolation, and it's alright for what it is. But there is one thing that I need to show you. At one point, the protagonist thinks he sees a woman sitting in a car, so he goes up to her to talk, happy to know he's not actually alone. Turns out the woman is a mannequin, and he immediately starts talking to it in a pretty sleazy way.
I'm terribly sorry, madam. I can assure you that at no time did I mean to be so upsetting. As a matter of fact, I've always had kind of a secret yen for the quiet type. Get what I mean, babe?
So that could just immediately be a double whammy +1 on both mannequin interactions and women being objectified, but I'll be fair and only give it the mannequins, since, well, it's not an actual woman. Still, that +1 might not be there on paper, but it will definitely stay in my heart. Now, before we get to the last part, I want to briefly mention I Am Legend and 28 Days Later. Technically, these ones are in the realm of post-apocalyptic zombie films, which obviously works on a much more straight-up horror handling of the last person trope. Often the focus is on how terrifying having zombies around is, so it doesn't really fit with what we're discussing today. But I'll make an exception for these two because they indeed put a very big emphasis on the loneliness of their protagonists. 28 Days Later has one of my favorite opening sequences of any film ever. Cillian Murphy waking up from a coma and then stumbling his way through an empty London trying to find any trace of life is just spine-chilling. East Hastings by Godspeed You Black Emperor playing in the background just beautifully adds to this desolation, and obviously Murphy's performance here is perfect, even though it might seem like he's not doing much. It's probably much harder than it looks to sell scenes like these without a clear idea of what you're doing with your body's movements, your facial expressions, and your voice, and he manages to do all of that. While afterwards the film goes more openly into the whole zombie apocalypse direction, it never forgoes this sense of loneliness and misery, giving it a very heavy, bleak atmosphere throughout. For once, we also finally get a more interesting female character that isn't a pushover in the form of Selena. She's tough and hardened by all she witnessed in these 28 days of chaos, and has a hard time trusting and getting close to anyone, because she knows she might have to kill them at any false move. And she actually saves the protagonist's life at the start. So, of course, as always, we gotta have some romance, but I feel like this is an example of how to handle it correctly for the most part. It is much more believable that the characters of Selena and Jim would grow attached to each other, and not just because, as the hateable Ana Lucia said,
"You both survived, she's hot, you're hot, it's what people do."
But because they are actually likable characters and do feel like real human beings. And while the film's length doesn't really allow the time needed to develop their relationship as well as could have been, it still goes about it in an incremental way. There's distrust, coldness, and fear at the start. Then they have a bunch of time to bond over their terrible situation and start to understand each other. Then the will to have something beyond just survival in this world, something to strive for, and something that gives a person reprise, like emotional attachment, opens the door for more obvious affection, with Selena even giving Jim a quick kiss on the cheek. This all culminates in the last third of the film, at the mansion, where Selena is at her lowest point of emotional fragility and Jim suddenly kisses her, to which she reciprocates, but only for a moment, suddenly breaking off and leaving the room. I find this to be a beautiful and very harrowing way to show what the other films and the show completely failed to. There is palpable tension in these scenes, the characters' emotions are handled realistically. It's obvious that they've developed feelings for each other, and while it might seem simpler for Jim because he's a dude, I guess, it's clear that Selena is conflicted about it. How can you even figure out if what you're feeling in that moment is real, or if the horrible situation you're both stuck in is making you more vulnerable and pushing you to grab onto any emotional relief you can find, which in this case comes in the form of a possible partner. And can she really trust Jim? They haven't known each other for very long, and this whole miserable context they're in surely sped things up. And he obviously picked a very wrong moment to make a move. So I think it all fits very well and it's handled with the necessary respect in this case. Where the film kinda loses points is in the last act. I'm not the first to point out that it's kind of silly in a film like this to have your character suddenly become a shirtless Rambo who goes on a rampage, takes out the military dudes one by one and saves the girl. Outside of not being believable because Jim is like 100 pounds wet, it's also a strange tonal shift. Of course, the idea here is to show that even a good man, when put in an extreme situation in which the people he loves are threatened, will show his violent and monstrous side and go to any lengths to save them.
So, like, the zombies are a metaphor for the latent, unstoppable rage and violence that all of us might harbor inside ourselves, bro.
And so we get this strange dichotomy between the evil military guys and our protagonist. The former wanting to abuse their power and subjugate the women and keep them as slaves for their own pleasure, which, fair, that's something that happens all the time in the real world, so it is a terrifying thing you can show. And the latter who becomes the unexpected hero of the situation, defeats the evil creeps and saves the day by rescuing the girls. For me, this oscillates between the aforementioned metaphor for what a man is capable of if pushed too hard, and just sort of a self-insert hero/savior complex kind of deal. I might be reading too much into it and applying a critical perspective to the film different than the one intended by the director, but I'll leave you to decide that. The only thing that nobody can really argue with is that this dynamic in the final act once again puts the female characters in the backseat, which is basically this video's secondary theme at this point. For God's sake, this is when we also finally get a full kiss between these two, and it just feels like the classic Hollywood trope of "and then they kiss at the end," kinda ruining all the well-handled setup that they created before. The other famous example of a lonely guy in the apocalypse is obviously I Am Legend, which is not a great film, and an even worse adaptation of the great novel by the same name, which I highly encourage you to read. But it does show us Will Smith's character basically surviving all by himself in a completely empty New York City. Well, almost empty, because everybody else has turned into bloodthirsty vampires, which are more like zombies in the film itself. Once again, the horror aspect of it is not really what interests us. It is the way the protagonist's loneliness is represented. And guess what? We have another example of a guy who starts talking to mannequins and actually hitting on one too, so there's our +1. But I also found it interesting that they give Will Smith a dog as a companion, which obviously doesn't talk to him, but we can probably assume that in this scenario even having a pet would be something that staves off the insanity of isolation. I found it to be an interesting addition, though as with everything else, even the dog is handled in a completely different way in the book, which I find to be more compelling. This version is much more theater-friendly, I guess, but that's alright.
That's the cutest fucking thing I've ever seen in my entire life.
Anyway, we also follow the protagonist through his daily routine and see the ways he passes time. Sometimes he goes hunting, seeing as the wild animals are now freely roaming the city. Other times he might just want to play golf. Oh, and he's also driving a cool-ass Mustang, so it's not like he doesn't allow himself to have some bonuses too. And I think most people would generally agree that this part is handled well enough. Looking back on the whole film, there are some genuinely good things about it. The first scene in which Will Smith explores the abandoned building and has to be mindful of not waving his flashlight around, then coming across the turned vampires and letting us see them for the first time sticks out particularly to me. It does build tension very well, and that reveal haunted my childhood for way too long. As many know, the alternate ending for the film also elevates the whole thing, by showing us that the vampires are actually sentient beings, and our protagonist is the real monster in their eyes for kidnapping their people and running experiments on them leading to their deaths. I like small touches like showing all the pictures of his patients on the wall in his lab while he's being spared by the vampires. A very simple visual storytelling, but very effective. That was also one of the main themes of the book, though the novel handles everything much better, and its more psychological approach makes the story much more horrifying if you ask me. While here, unfortunately, seeing as this was a blockbuster that had to sell tickets, there's an over-reliance on action scenes, jump scares, and just a lot of CGI slop, which makes it impossible to take the monsters seriously. I honestly don't understand why they didn't just use real actors in costumes but instead opted for these PS3 looking ass NPCs, but whatever. We also, once again, obviously have a female character showing up in the last act of the film, this time with her son. Although our protagonist is actually the one getting saved, which is nice for a change. Now these two pretty obviously act as the substitutes for the wife and child that the protagonist lost when the city plunged into chaos. Something to give him hope for the future, you know? Quite heavy-handed, but alright. I won't deny that some of the little moments with all of them are nice and sweet, and I think it's nowhere near as creepy or shady as the other examples I've shown you. This is also used for some debates about faith and science, seeing as Anna is a believer who wants to find a survivor's camp, while the protagonist is a man of science and thinks that the best bet is to stay there and work on a cure. This would be all nice and interesting if the writing wasn't so mid, which is probably the biggest problem with this whole act. At the end of the day, I Am Legend offers a nice rendition of the last man trope, carried mainly by Will Smith's acting chops, and the dogs too, and is watchable enough even with all its many flaws. So here we are, finally at the last case study. Pluribus is one of the best, most original and most compelling shows in the last, I don't know how many years, honestly. If you haven't watched it yet, you absolutely need to. Although, if you're the kind of person that's suffering from chronic overstimulation from fast-paced content, you might end up in the group of smooth brains who dislike the show because, quote, nothing happens. Yes, alright, it is a very slow show, and no, it doesn't have huge set pieces or action-packed scenes, it's not very bombastic, and you can totally dislike it because you find it too boring. But saying that nothing happens in it is just, you know, objectively wrong and misleading. If that sounds like you, I would still advise you to summon all that's left of your attention span and to give the show a chance, because you might fall in love with it. I will be going over some important story elements, though I will try to be as vague as possible whenever I can, especially at the start, so even if you haven't seen it yet, it won't ruin the whole thing for you. I still think you should stop the video here and watch the show, then come back, but I'll leave that to your discretion. So, Pluribus is, technically, not a last man kind of scenario. In fact, most of the population of the world is still around, but almost everyone has been changed, with the exception of our protagonist, Carol Sturka, and a few others scattered around the globe. Everyone else has become part of a hive mind. The hive mind will do anything that the normal humans ask of it, as long as it doesn't include hurting any living being. This obviously is a great chance to show what many people would do in this scenario through one of the characters, who is basically leading the most opulent life possible. Flying around the world in the Air Force One, staying at the most expensive hotels, drinking and eating like a king, having the company and obedience of any person he wants, especially beautiful women in this case, and not really worrying about any of the ethical problems that might arise in this situation. It will be interesting to see if the show explores how long this can be sustained for, if this particular character will ever get tired of this farce, or if it's really a dream come true. Of course, in this case, the isolation aspect is very relative because there are a lot of people with whom you might have conversations and who can keep you company. In fact, you're able to talk to any person on the planet through the hive mind. Want to have a deep philosophical discussion? Well, here's the combined knowledge of all living philosophers. Want to talk films? Here's all living directors speaking to you. Want to learn how to cook like a Michelin chef? Here's the combined minds of all the chefs in the world, etc, etc, etc. You get the point. The big problem is obviously that, well, it is a hive mind. It's technically impossible to have a real conversation with a real individual, somebody human, flawed, unpredictable, somebody who would disagree with you. The hive mind at times seems like a direct parallel of an AI chatbot. It always tends to agree with you and always tries to satisfy anything you ask of it. This, of course, could get depressing and boring real fast, and even if you do technically have one or more people in front of you, it will probably start feeling fake and uninspiring after a while. Even introverted people like me who avoid others whenever they have a chance will probably start missing the flaws and inconsistencies that make humans, well, human. But this is not even the part that interests us, really. The part that actually fits the last person trope much better is basically the middle section of this first season, where after getting into some heavy disagreements with the hive mind, Carol is left completely alone in Albuquerque. With the silver lining that she can actually call the hive mind to get whatever she wants, but they will not directly interact with her. And here we get some of the usual, at this point, stages of loneliness we've seen so far. At first we get denial, where she's still trying to find out things about the hive mind and learn anything that might help her cure this disease, let's call it. After finding something pretty shocking, if you know you know, she even drives out to meet with that other character I've mentioned who is living large in Las Vegas, in Elvis's street. Here he basically tells her to chill out and accept the situation, also reveals some pretty important info that helps her to calm down, because she doesn't feel like she's threatened by the hive mind anymore. Like, if you've seen the show, you know what I'm talking about. With this knowledge, she drives back and basically begins to take advantage of this accommodation they have going on. She too starts hanging out. She plays golf, starts driving a Rolls Royce, goes to the hot springs, steals one of her favorite paintings from a museum, etc. You get the point. We even have a scene of her playing golf on top of a parking garage, trying to break the windows of the adjacent building, which specifically reminded me of that one scene from I Am Legend. Now I'll have to get into some pretty heavy spoilers, so be warned, you can skip this section using the timestamps. So, as anyone could have predicted, this is all just a temporary reprise. After a while of being alone and trying to basically distract herself, Carol reaches her tipping point. At the start of the series, her wife, Helen, who seemed like the only close person she really had, gets infected by the virus and dies after falling and hitting her head. This is obviously a very traumatic experience that will loom over Carol for the duration of the whole season. And it creates some clear tension when the hive mind sends Zosha as an intermediator. While Carol seems like someone who can enjoy being alone, it's obvious that the hole left in her life by Helen's death is constantly eating at her. So while she tries to find some sort of balance, it becomes clear after some time that, just like all the other characters we've mentioned today, things aren't working out. She ends up completely apathetic. Sitting in the middle of her cul-de-sac, she lets fireworks shoot around her in a circle. One of these tips over and ends up pointing her way. She turns towards it and just sits there, waiting for it to blow up. It just about misses her, and the next day she finally gives in and writes down a message for the hive mind. come back. And they do. Zosha once again shows up on her doorstep and Carol hugs her, seemingly not caring anymore if it's a hive mind or a normal person in front of her. The important thing is that she's not alone anymore. From here, for a while, it seems like she finally accepts the hive mind's companionship and tries to understand them, and not just to figure them out and find a cure as she did before. After all, their whole existence is predicated on unity. There is no disagreement, no violence, everyone is existing in harmony, and they keep saying how beautiful it is and how good it feels. It's the exact opposite of loneliness. And here you could draw a lot of parallels to cults and how they take a person at their lowest and loneliest moment and show them just how amazing and harmonious their community is, that they will not need to be alone anymore, that there is something bigger to strive for and they can do it together. Just like it isn't surprising how many people end up in these cults, it is also not surprising how vulnerable Carol allows herself to be with the hive mind now. It is especially poignant when you factor in Carol's past brush with cult-like communities, seeing as she had been sent to a conversion camp when she was younger, which is such a fitting touch that explains so much about her character, be it her cynical and at times bitter personality, or her unwillingness to drink the proverbial Kool-Aid when compared to the other normal people left. As you know if you watch the show, this all comes crashing down by the end when it is revealed that the hive mind is still trying to work on a version of the virus that could infect Carol, by using her frozen eggs. And this is such an invasion of her privacy and her body that it is enough to shatter the illusion and bring her back to reality, rejecting the hive mind once again and getting back on track. So, as I already said, this of course is not a good, pure example of the last man trope, but none of these are? Isn't it curious that none of the media that actually openly plays into this trope ever fully delivers on it? Why does there always have to be at least another character? Be it another person, a pet, or even a robot like in that one Tom Hanks film. At this point, it's almost like the last man on Earth trope implies the presence of somebody else, as if this was itself a part of the trope, which is just ironic. Well, the answer should be quite obvious. It is incredibly difficult to make a film, show, or even to write a book about a single character. It either runs the risk of being too dull, or maybe go into the extreme and become almost abstract, as seen in something like Samuel Beckett's work, specifically The Unnameable. That kind of stuff is barely comprehensible for someone passionate about literature, let alone a general audience. It's difficult, but it's not impossible. And I think it shows in how beautiful and interesting the actual alone sections of the films and shows I've mentioned today are. If you go and look up Reddit threads about The Last Man on Earth when it had just started airing, the number one complaint you'll see is that everyone wished for it to stick with its concept, at least for a little longer. It's like everyone felt kinda betrayed by the introduction of more characters, while a lot of people were completely on board for those first 17 minutes of Phil being alone in the world. This goes to show that there is a hunger for something like that in the audiences, and I think it would be especially true now when the world seems to be reaching its zenith of madness and everyone's expecting another world war. It seems like a lot of the illusions of the past have been slowly but surely falling, leaving more and more people disenfranchised with, well, the reality we inhabit. And so often I personally end up thinking that hell is truly other people. I've had this idea for a while that no matter how well you try to live your life, no matter how nice you try to be towards others, no matter how much goodness you put out there will always be someone somewhere who will try to ruin things, to put a wrench in your plans in some way. There is such a proliferation of ignorance at this point in time where so many of us should seemingly have all the tools we need to come out of our state of mental minority. We could and should evolve as people, but so many decide to just squabble about the most trivial and insane shit. And I don't find it weird to fantasize about everyone finally shutting the hell up and just disappearing. It is a freeing fantasy, a peaceful one. Until it isn't. Unfortunately, 99% of us would probably come to their breaking point when the loneliness and the directionless life that this implies becomes so heavy that they'll either want to disappear with everyone else or they'll go insane. Maybe you could even be stoic about it and just live out the rest of your days like that, but I'm willing to bet that it won't be a very fulfilling existence. At the end of it, we are social beings, we need the presence of others from time to time, and we weren't made for a solipsistic life. That's also why, in all of the examples I've shown today, the question of companionship is ever present. And I don't want to criticize that. It's a pretty obvious way to execute this theme. I just wish we got some more variety, I guess. And I don't even mean to say that I have a problem with these films being made by men and through a man's logic, for whom obviously the problem of missing the company of women will be a huge deal. But I just wish for something to show us all of the other stuff, to be a broader commentary on loneliness and other people, on what we really have left when no one's around. And also that if you do decide to use that same trope and just add a female character, make her a real character and not just an object of desire that ends up in some melodramatic love triangle, of all the interesting things you could explore, why go for the most overplayed one? Funnily enough, the strange analog horror / vlog series I briefly talked about in my last video, the Glennon Archives, is delving into that. Although I do find some of the ways in which this is represented to be a bit dull for now, because it's basically the protagonist telling us directly about his feelings. While I'd love to see something that plays more with visual storytelling that doesn't need to have a character that spells out what they think. But again, I think that something like that could only work with a master behind the camera. Then there's also the obvious commentary on capitalism, with the characters always going to grab expensive objects, cars, houses and such as one of the first things. But honestly, it never felt really explored enough and just kinda devolves into a material things can't substitute the presence of people and won't be enough to keep you happy, which was kind of a letdown. Also, why did I keep the tally on the interacting with mannequins thing? Well, because on the one side, it could be a sign that all of these pieces of media are inspired by what came before. On the other is that it's such an obvious way to represent the character's loneliness. Obviously, mannequins have human features, and at some point the characters are so lonely that this is enough to give them some form of company, but also, can you just come up with something new for Pete's sake? It's just an uninventive part of the trope, and I can't understand why every single time they keep repeating it. Maybe it's just my own personal crusade born from some strange fixation on the problem, but I am bored to tears by mannequins. I know that's a really specific thing to complain about. Yes, I might be not yet diagnosed. We see a lot of horror media use mannequins too, and it's always for the same reason. They look almost human, so it's uncanny, and uncanny is spooky. Ooh, no, stop, it's not spooky. They're just stupid plastic statues. Can you really find nothing else? Do you have to use the same thing that's been used a billion times already? Whatever, as I said, personal complaint. So, at the end of it all, I just feel a bit underwhelmed. While it was interesting to find a seemingly contradictory trend in all of these examples of the last man trope, it also means that I still haven't found a piece of media that satisfies my hunger for this fantasy. And yeah, of course we're talking about escapism here in my case, but you know, sometimes you just want some of that. I can't help but imagine how fascinating a film that actually goes all the way with the concept would be, and I think that now would be the best time to make something like that. The positive note at the end of it, I guess, would be that Pluribus finally shook things up. Not only do we have a female protagonist who feels like a real person and not just a man's object, but we also have some of the best exploration of her loneliness and search for balance in such a context. Which is very ironic considering that the last man trope is even less applicable in this case when compared to the others. So yeah, this ended up being a lot longer than I expected. I don't know if it turned out interesting or not, but I hope you enjoyed it. If you have to take anything away from this is that you should watch Pluribus. I know that this whole theme could also be applied to video games, with probably more interesting and varied results, but this is long enough as it is, so maybe I'll leave that one for a separate video. Let me know your thoughts in the comments, and as usual, thank you very much for watching. A special thank you goes out to my patrons and YouTube members, for whom, by the way, I've also created a small Discord server in which we give each other recommendations and just chat about media and about ideas for videos. It's been a pretty nice time so far, so if you're interested in that, consider joining. You'll find the links on Patreon and in the membership posts. For now, goodbye, and see you, space introverts.